Okay guys, your moment has arrived, your psych revision video. So we're gonna go through everything you need for paper 3, remembering that I'm gonna write this multiple times, but you always have to be specific to the prompt. So this is giving you guidance of how to structure your responses, but they need to keep relating back to the prompt throughout. So we're gonna do 2 pages. So 2 pages total. This page, we're gonna do one kind of big chart on the research methods. That's gonna cover question 1A, which is what research method was it with characteristics, and then 1C, which is asking what other research method could you do. So I'm gonna basically recommend pairings. And then at the bottom, we'll do the sampling methods, which will be 1B. So this should be all of question 1. And it's pretty spread out, so there's plenty of room. And then we're gonna do question 2 and 3 on the next page. But space it however feels meaningful for you. All right, so let's write at the top our title that this is IB Psychology, Paper 3, Research Methods. Okay, so like I said, we are gonna break them down by question. So this first chart that we're gonna do is gonna cover us for questions 1A and C, which are the questions that are specifically related to the actual method and the alternative method. So methods and alternatives. Now you, of course, are gonna have to work out what the method is for yourself, so I can't do that part for you, but I will give you some of the characteristics to say, which should also help you in working out what it is. So we're gonna essentially do it by 4 big categories, and then we're gonna do the types within that. So I would recommend, if you know for sure the specific type, state it. If you're not sure, just write the general categories. So a lot of times there's a point for each. So there's a point for saying it's an experiment, and then there's an additional point for potentially identifying it as a quasi-experiment, or there's a point for saying observation, and then a point for saying naturalistic observation. So give the most specific answer that you know, but if you are not sure, you can refer to it by its broader category. So if you can't tell if it's structured or semi-structured, just at least refer to it as an interview, is kind of a general guideline there. So the 4 main categories of methods that you're going to see. So we're gonna make a chart. It's gonna say method. Then the next category is gonna say types. And I'm gonna kind of define or give characteristics of the types there. Then we'll do a bit of kind of general characteristics. Some of these will be true of kind of all of the different ones that belong in that category. And then I'm gonna put, do I have room still? Yep, compatible method. So basically guiding you into what I would recommend that you include as your other options. So based on kind of what it looks like. Okay, so let's start with experiment. So a reminder, it can be qualitative or quantitative. So half and half from what I've looked at. So it looks like about half the time it's a quantitative method, half the time it's qualitative. So you need to be prepared for either. So the method could be an experiment. Again, so if it's an experiment, the ones I've seen so far are either a true experiment or a quasi. I haven't actually seen a natural experiment, but in theory it could be. So true experiment, or it could be a quasi or natural. But again, what we've seen so far is quasi, and that does show up a fair bit, so we want to be prepared for that. So remembering that what makes it true is the random allocation of the IV. And we're going to use that term random allocation rather than manipulation, because that's a little bit more specific. And then if this is the case, it's using some sort of pre-existing groups or conditions. So that is our distinguisher between a true and quasi-experiment, which we should know well. Okay, so let's look at characteristics. So I'm going to put a few dot points. So you are going to be identify the method and list characteristics. So these are things that if you were listing characteristics, I would cover, but being specific to the prompt. So we'll make a little note. We're going to write this repeatedly so we don't forget. So we're going to, again, be specific to the prompt. I'm just going to write be specific, to the prompt. Okay, so these are 3 things I would highlight if I was talking about an experiment, but I would give it in the context. So it is always an experiment if it is investigating the effect of an IV on a DV. So again, if I'm saying be specific, you would want to identify what the IV and DV are. So state what they are in this context. A really good point to make, and this is also true if you're writing an ERQ on research methods, is that if you're doing experiments, you are gathering quantitative data for statistical analysis, for hypothesis testing. And that's one that you probably don't necessarily have to be super specific on unless it tells you any information about the statistical analysis. So it may tell you a correlation was calculated, or it might tell you means were calculated. So if it gives you some information about the data or the analysis, then you can include that kind of specific information. If it doesn't tell you what kind of statistical test was done, you can just say this would have been able to have statistical tests done on it. And then the other thing that we want to say is any case, whether it's a true or quasi, usually the goal is to have standardized procedures and controlled variables. So standardized procedures and controlled variables are going to be characteristics of an experiment. Remember, if we want to talk about cause and effect, that would only be relevant if it was in a true experiment. We're not actually being asked to evaluate in this question. So you don't necessarily need to say that you cannot in a quasi, because this is not an evaluation, so it's just characteristics. So we just don't refer to it one way or another, but you can refer to it in a true experiment as a positive. Okay, so then what would be a compatible method? So most of the others, I'm going to give you a quite specific one. Here it's going to kind of depend on what the DV was being gathered. So for instance, if it was an experiment where they were basically manipulated into conditions and then some sort of kind of questionnaire afterwards, then it would be appropriate potentially to do an interview. And that would give you kind of deeper insights. So if the DV is some sort of feelings, so if the DV was kind of perceptions or feelings, then it would be appropriate to pair that with an interview, and that would give you kind of deeper insights. So we'd say, okay, they were allocated to 2 conditions, and then based on those 2 conditions, they filled in some sort of questionnaire, and then like now I'm going to interview them one-on-one and get their insights. The other option would be to do an observation, and in particular I would do like a naturalistic. And so that would be if your DV was some sort of behavior. So what you were doing for your DV was watching or observing some sort of behavior, and then the observation could be done in a kind of more naturalistic environment. So greater ecological validity, things like that. So one of those 2, there's not necessarily a straightforward one because it does kind of depend on the experiment. So obviously if it was something like Bandura, I would be wanting to look at something more like a naturalistic experiment. But if it was something like stereotype threat, I might be wanting to look at an interview and ask them, how did that make you feel? What were the kind of perceptions you were having? Things like that. So it kind of depends on the experiment. So you'll have to kind of work your way through, but I would pick one of those because they are both qualitative methods. So it's a completely different method. All right, let's keep going with quantitative methods. So the other thing it could be is a survey. So survey versus qualitative method, versus correlational. So survey means that they are giving a self-report of their opinions. A survey can include a correlational study. In a correlational study, it's a focus on two continuous variables that are being compared. So correlational studies are a type of survey. For that reason, I think you would be okay to just call all of them a survey. So I think you would be all right. We'll kind of include that as a subtype. So survey, and so a general survey would just cover lots of information. So general would be kind of mini self-report topics. Or we can be more specific and call it correlational. So if it's general, there are essentially more than two things being studied. So we're not necessarily only looking at two specific things. So it's going to be kind of a range of topics. So it might be anything related to kind of health, sleep, well-being. So there's a lot being covered, and we would be looking at kind of different relationships. If it's correlational, the key is going to be that there are two continuous, which in general, if you're doing a survey, they're all being mapped on a continuous thing, so that's pretty standard. Variables that are believed to be in relationship. So a general survey just covers a lot more. A correlational uses a survey to really focus on two things. So that's kind of your distinction there. Okay, so what would we say in terms of characteristics? So and again, I was using the orange just to emphasize, like, when I say specific, be specific there about what were the procedures that were actually being controlled and so forth. Okay, so if I'm doing this, I want to identify right away that this is a self-report measure. So that is an important category. So it is self-report. It is going to generate quantitative data. And again, as above, that means it's going to be able to have statistical analysis. With usually some sort of hypothesis testing. Sometimes it's not, if it's a general survey, it may not be testing one specific hypothesis. So experiments are really precise, like this is the hypothesis. Here it might just be testing for correlations. So you might be saying, well, what does it tell me? Is there a correlation between this and this? So there is in general usually some sort of statistical analysis to look for that. Usually the way in which quantitative data is obtained is because the survey utilizes a numeric scale. So again, look at the prompt. Does the prompt give you any information about that that would be helpful? The other thing that's important that we want to talk about, so we don't really talk about standardized procedures and controlled variables. Usually you're just handing someone something, so there's not a lot of procedures. One thing that's important for surveys, which we're going to come to when you do it as a suggestion, but surveys are really good because they tend to be efficient for large sample size. So what you can do is, because they require minimal kind of effort of the experimenter, you can very quickly get information from a large pool of population. So that's a benefit. If a survey has been the research method, I would pretty much always say that your suggestion should be an interview. So it makes sense to stay with a self-report method because usually self-report is appropriate to what they're being done. You could try and come up with an experiment that might be good, but you might be going off into left field. So the easiest thing is, if they did a survey, then you want to say deeper insights, do an interview. So if you do an interview, you can get deeper insights. You can ask for clarification. So benefits there of doing an interview are that you can get more information and provides an opportunity to check and make sure you're clear on what they're sharing. All right, I'm going to erase just so I don't have to squat down. So you've got two more in your chart. So those are my two quantitative. And again, 50-50 from what I've seen. So when you're doing your preparation for this, you don't want to overly attend to only qualitative just because those are more new. They do ask about experiments quite a lot, which is nice because those are probably, to be honest, easier. So really, it would be lovely if we got a nice experiment The only thing that you have to be careful of is students getting confused and referring to it as a survey or as an observation when in fact something has been manipulated. So always check, did they manipulate anything? If so, or was there any sort of groups being compared? Is there any clear IV? If there's a clear IV, you need to call it an experiment. All right, last two, observations and interviews. What you'll notice I did not include on my chart is a case study. Reason being that case studies are a combination of methods. So I don't think they never have included a case study. I don't think they'll include a case study because it's not its own distinct method. So for that reason, I expect they would not do it. So that's why I'm not including it. If so, I think it would be fairly obvious. It's like one man was studied for 19 years, case study. So I think it would be stand out if that was the case. Okay, so observation, so the different categories. So probably the most important, so remember we talked about essentially that there's 4 different distinctions. So there's covert versus overt. So with observations, it's kind of easy to get your characteristics because you just go through these types and kind of describe each of these. So then there's participant versus non-participant. There's naturalistic versus not. And then there's structured versus unstructured. You're basically going to have to answer as many of those as you can. Hopefully they should give you enough information to answer all 4. And that basically becomes your characteristics because you're essentially explaining each of those types as your characteristics. So again, what are we looking for here is, are they aware? What we're looking for here is, are they detached or involved in some way? What we're looking for here is it an authentic everyday setting? And what we're looking for here is there some sort of checklist of behaviors? Okay, so those are kind of your 4 things. So in terms of what are we looking at in terms of overall characteristics, if you wanted to include some of those as well. So in general, what stands out is that we are recording behaviors without any manipulation. So I'm saying grouping because we have to be careful as well because a quasi-experiment could involve comparing behaviors of this group versus that. So we haven't manipulated, but we're still making a distinction. If it's an observation, there's not, so there's basically means there's no IV. So you're not looking at any specific independent variable, you're just recording behaviors more generally. Next, particularly if they are naturalistic, the goal is usually to get some sort of, I use the word authentic again, but don't write it twice, but so generally this one is a point that's very specific to naturalistic. Most observations are naturalistic. I would expect if they asked you about an observation, it would probably be naturalistic. Lab observations are very rare, so most observations are going to be naturalistic. That is by far the most common. There are some instances of lab observations, but most of the time they're naturalistic. So the goal is to have an everyday setting that gives you an insight into authentic behavior. And then otherwise, you're just going to define the subtypes. So that's your characteristics. If you are doing an observation, I would say you're compatible. You could say anything. So you could pair it with an interview. So you could say, observed it, now I want to stop and ask them. So there's kind of 2 different options. Experiments work pretty well because experiments allow you to then kind of isolate in a variable and study it. So if you do an experiment, that would allow you to isolate kind of one IV. And they would also allow you to do some statistical analysis, etc. So it's usually a pretty good pair to say like you observed everyone and then do you see a specific thing that needs more kind of unpacking. If you're like, oh, I can't really see an obvious experiment, then it also works well to just pair this with an interview. because basically that would go from I observed your behavior to giving the participants a chance to self-report. So now your participants can self-report. So that's a good chance to say, giving a chance for them to have voice in terms of that. So kind of depends on the observation. Either of those will work. Okay, lucky last, we have interviews. There are, again, 4 types. So these are for this or that. These are 4 distinct categories. Ideally, you do identify the specific type. If you're not sure, just refer to it as an interview. I would probably say research method is an interview. Then I would say the type is semi-structured. The reason I'm saying that is if you just come in and say it's a semi-structured interview, and they're saying it's structured, you could get the whole method wrong. Whereas if you say interview first, you can get 1 point, and then you only lose the point for semi-structured. So interview is the method, type is this. So that would be my recommendation. So we have structured, we have unstructured, we have semi-structured, and then we have focus groups. They do love a good focus group. So focus groups are commonly used. Focus groups are a subtype of interview. So you can say interview done in focus groups, or you can just call it a focus group. If you're confident it's a focus group, you can just go straight to that. And then the distinction really depends on the type of questions for the first 3. So these are set questions in set order. So essentially, you don't add anything else. You always do those questions in that order. Unstructured is basically just a conversation. It might have topics in mind, but rarely has written questions. And then semi-structured usually has some set questions. So essentially, these are questions that are going to get covered, but you can add questions or go in a different direction as appropriate. Semi-structured is probably the most common because of the limitations of both of the others. So that is basically the reason why we generally would prefer semi-structured. And of course, focus groups are going to be done in groups with a facilitator. So the facilitator, usually rather than an interviewer, because they're usually, rather than just asking question after question, they're asking like topics and then kind of stepping back, but then getting it back on track as needed. Okay, so characteristics, we do want to make sure we say that this is self-report. So this is a form of self-report. We do want to say that almost all of them are going to use open-ended questions. And that's going to be what stands apart from a survey. So we are asking questions that have longer responses to try to get those deep insights. So open-ended questions. And then they are going to require skilled interviewers. So that is worth noting, particularly, so skilled interviewers or facilitators. Particularly in the less structured ones, so particularly for unstructured and for focus groups. So if the more open, the more skill that is required. And they're going to provide rich data, but usually also quite hard to analyze. Particularly something like a focus group, you're going to end up with just like tons of it. It's usually transcribed, and then you just have to figure out how to sort through it. So again, you don't necessarily have to criticize it. It's not evaluate, but that can be a thing as it collects a large volume of data, which can be challenging to analyze. So if it's done, it's usually done with like content analysis. So inductive content analysis. Again, mention that if it shows up in the prompt. So again, I was trying to kind of emphasize what are some specifics. So here, be specific about what the behavior is that they were actually observing. Be specific about the setting to the prompt. Here, what kind of questions, like it probably gives you some information. What kind of questions? Is there any mention of an interviewer who's doing it? And so those are some things you can be specific. If you get an interview, I would say, do a survey. To me, that is the clearest, easiest link. You can try to squish the, like you could say, now do an experiment, but the most obvious thing is to do a survey. The reason why you would do a survey is 2 things. First of all, that would then give you quantitative objective data, which means that you could do statistical testing. So you're going to do this interview, but a lot of times your interview is hard to analyze. So if you paired it with also then giving a survey, you could get some quantitative data. And that also would enable, therefore you could do a hypothesis, and it would also enable you to have a larger sample size. So it might be that if you're interviewing, you can really only reasonably interview 20 people, and then that's all that can be done. So then if you pair that with actually doing a survey, you can do a larger sample size. Okay, so that's all things research methods. So that's 6 of your marks out of 24. So we're about a quarter of the way through. So that's 1A and 1C for that. So let's go ahead and do 1B now. So I'm just gonna erase and keep running through and do the sampling. The sampling is usually a pretty easy one. So these are 3 marks. They're usually a pretty good 3 marks. If you know your sampling, you can usually identify it. And again, you can pretty much memorize your characteristics that you're going to say. Be specific. So anyway, 6 that we're going to go through. So 6 different methods. So we're at question 1B now. Sampling methods. And we're going to make our reminder. Well, we'll do it when we do the chart. Okay, so 6 methods to choose from. I haven't actually ever seen one that I think would classify as snowball sampling, so we're going to include that in case this is their year for snowball sampling. But in general, I think you're probably more likely to see one of the others. Okay, and I have enough time to write to the prompt. So whatever your characteristics are, be specific to the prompt. So if it was like convenience, where were they pulled from? So why was it a convenient group? So if we say it's convenient, why? What was the group? Was it their own students? What was the actual way in which that was done? All right, so we'll go through the random and stratified first. So random sampling would be ideal. Random sampling is very difficult to do. So again, it's probably not the most likely to show up. But if for it to be random sampling, every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. So there needs to be some sort of like selecting. Now remember, they still have to choose to do it. So even with involuntary, they would still have to give consent. So they're not forced into it, but they have an equal chance of being chosen by the researcher. I hope they can read. The lighting's a bit bad on that. Anyway, so and then for your other ones, even though it's not evaluate, sometimes evaluative statements are helpful for working out what your points are going to be. So this is going to be the kind of the least bias. Or we'll just say less bias because potentially stratified. Although stratified has a bit of bias in terms of what you consider to be a strata. So truly random is probably the least biased method, but it is logistically challenging. So you only need the method in 2 statements. So potentially every member has an equal chance. It is a less biased, better representative. So when we say less biased, the sample is more likely to be representative. So that is kind of the benefit of that. Okay, related to that then is stratified sampling. Stratified sampling is really a subset of random, but in this case, you will randomly sample within groups. Groups are usually some sort of demographic, which just means it could be by gender, it could be by age, so it could be by culture. So it doesn't have to be stratified for everything. Probably the most common way you'll see it done is for gender or age, because it's relatively easy to establish that. They're very nice and clear distinctions. So if they're picking within year levels, for instance, that would be a form of stratified. So it's random within the groups. So that is really the most representative. Because you're actually making sure all the groups are kind of as they exist in the population. It's not necessarily the least biased because there can be bias associated with which strata do you consider to be, like if you're doing culture, are you including all the ones that are relevant? Are you excluding minor strata? So there's a few biases, you don't really need to get into that. But if I were doing it, I would define it, and then I would say that it's most representative. Again, be specific. How was there an equal chance? Did they pull them out of a hat? Did you do it by phone number? What was given to you as that? And what demographic group did the prompt tell you they were looking at? Was it age? Was it gender? Was it so forth? All right, the most common is going to be opportunity sampling. One thing you need to think about for opportunity versus purposive. Opportunity means it's not based on their characteristics. It's simply based on their, the fact that they're already there. So it's based on a pre-existing or already convened group. So the most common thing that you'll see is a pre-existing or already convened group. So essentially they're already in a group and you're going to use it. You're not actually doing it because of what the nature of the group is. So if you do university students because you're looking at techniques and lecturing, note-taking, then it matters that they're university students. So then you might need to think whether that's actually purposive. But if it's just looking at some random task and you're doing university students because they're there and they're already in groups that are easy to test on, that's just opportunity sampling. So that is very common. The reasons it's done are kind of efficiency, more control over EVs. So that's particularly for experiments. If they're already in a group, it can allow for more kind of control. If it's in a qualitative methods, most of the time it's just efficiency for the researcher. So they're just a pre-existing group. So pre-existing or already convened group. If you are going to say this in the prompt, what was the group? Were they already there because they were getting screened for screen cancer? That was one of the prompts. Okay, then that's how they were done. Were they a workplace that was chosen and they happened to be employees of that workplace? That's a pre-existing kind of group that was chosen. Now they may within that group ask for volunteers, but we've already kind of chosen the sample group. So that's kind of what's key. Self-selecting you have to be careful with because all samples have to be voluntary. So no one is forcing anyone to do studies. So if it is self-selecting, so we call it self-selecting, not voluntary, because voluntary, again, every sample should be voluntary. So what we're going to clarify for self-selecting is that there needs to be advertised to a larger group. So there basically needs to be asking a very large group for a small number of volunteers. So asking a group who's already there if they're willing to volunteer is opportunity sampling. But putting a flyer out so that lots of people see it and some choose, that's volunteering. Okay, so this one, the problem is that volunteers are usually have unique characteristics. So it comes with bias. It is, however, nicely ethical. So the reason why it is done is because it does have that added benefit that they're not feeling at all like, oh, they kind of asked me to do it, I have to do it. They're truly choosing to do it. But it does come with a fair amount of bias. All right, so you'll see quite a lot of opportunity, quite a lot of self-selecting. In qualitative methods, you'll also see quite a lot of purposive. Sometimes the prompt will tell you it's purposive. If that's the case, then you're not going to get a point for it. So you need to make sure you have several kind of that you really explain what their purpose was. So here they are basically being chosen for unique characteristics that align with the aim. And usually their unique characteristics are needed for for the study's aim. So if you're going to talk about a purposive sample, what you would need to do is outline very clearly what are the unique characteristics. So what were they chosen for, and why was that related to the aim? So why did they need to be chosen for that purpose? If you are doing a purposive sample, that means you cannot really generalize, and it's immediately going to mean that at most, you could transfer the results. So if you needed a third point, you would basically, because again, it may tell you the word purposive. It tells you that, same if it tells you a convenient sample is chosen, you need 3 points then. You're not going to get a point for saying back to them. So think that through. So what are the unique characteristics? Why was that necessary for the aim? And the fact that because it was a unique sample, it could not be generalized to a broader population. It could only be transferred, which might be what you're covering in question 3 anyway, but it doesn't hurt to put that there to make sure you get your 3 marks. All right, and then last one, which again, I have not ever seen in an example one, but we'll cover it because why not? Would be a snowball sample. And a snowball sample is basically when it's like a word of mouth recruitment. It can help with a purposive sample, so it can be beneficial for a specific need. So if you were looking at kind of like, I specifically want to interview expats from a certain country and you know a couple, well, they probably know a bunch more. So it can be really helpful for a really unique sample, but it also has the risk of being biased because now they might all belong to essentially kind of a friendship group and so forth. So it's a bit more of a biased way, but it can be useful. So sometimes it can be purposive with snowballing. So then we're kind of adding to that. All right, so that's question 1. We'll go on to question 2 next. Next up, we're going to do ethics. Ethics should be a pretty easy one. The most important thing for ethics is going to be to make sure that you be specific to the prompt. I'm going to do the ethics in reporting and implying, just in case. So again, they have consistently asked for ethics in the study. So that is what you should be most likely to encounter. But we're going to do the other just because they could show up, and we'll double check in the May exam if that does happen. So we don't want to be unprepared for it. So we'll just do a quick little note on it. So again, the 2 topics you could be is that were ethics that were implied in the study. And then the other prompt you could get is that the ethics in reporting and applying the results. Okay, so it is 6 marks. Ideally, here you're going to be 3 that were done and 3 that could be added. If you absolutely, if the way it's written, there was clearly 4 that were done, then just go with what they told you. So ideally 3 and 3 that were clearly considered and you have evidence of, 3 that could be done. And then for this, you're going to want to do 3 that were related to reporting and 3 that were related to applying. Okay, so you should know these 6, so this should be pretty easy. And again, the key is going to be that you are going to be really specific, particularly the 3 that were done. That's going to be the most important, that those be really specific. So how were they done? What specifically was told you in the prompt? So how do you know that they had informed consent? Did it say they signed a form? So be as specific as possible. So these are the 6 that I would basically go through. So I would do number 1, voluntary participation with informed consent. So again, what makes it voluntary is that we are clear that there is no coercion. What makes it informed is that they know the purpose. So when you look at informed, not the purpose, we need to be clear that they know the method. So voluntary, no coercion. Informed, they know what the method is. Related to that, deception. Deception can be used Doesn't have to be. So you're just stating, was it used or not? Do remember that we have talked about usually for the aim is the most common thing that you'll see. So was there a deceptive aim used? And be specific, or they might not have. And a lot of times in qualitative research, there is no deception. They know exactly what you're asking them about. So is there deception or not is what you're going to think about in terms of that. So if there's deception, that's usually more likely in an experimental concept. Have they specifically been told about their right to withdraw? Again, if they don't mention it in the prompt, it doesn't mean they definitely didn't let them withdraw. It just means it would also be beneficial if they were explicitly told. Number 4 then, do we see any concerns about undue stress or harm? Sometimes you'll see that phrase in mark schemes, it's like protection of the participants or the role of the researcher. So we can look at how that phrases, but I'm happy for you to phrase it as undue stress or harm. So do we see any kind of thing that suggests that they might be experiencing anything beyond day to day? So remember the questions that we're asking here is it unexpected or is it predictable? Is it outside normal hassles? And is it lingering? Those are probably more important questions for ERQs, but it works here as well. So is there anything that suggests that the stress that they're experiencing is beyond what just day-to-day stress is? Or is it anything that suggests it's going to be ongoing? Number 5, they then, particularly if deception has occurred, like no matter what, they need to be debriefed. They should be debriefed on the aim and access to the results. And then particularly if it's in a one that's sensitive, so they should be told the aim if there was deception, results, and if relevant, do they need to be offered any sort of support? So if they're debriefed right afterwards, they may not know the results yet. So you may want to look at, is there any follow-up to follow through with the results and offers of support? And then your last one is where you have to be careful because it's one of 2. So it's either anonymity or confidentiality. So with anonymity, that works really well with quantitative methods. That basically means that the identity is not known. So if you're filling in a survey, you would not be writing your name on it. So you're just getting a random survey. So usually the identity is not known, only the condition in an experiment. If it is a qualitative method, you are doing an observation or an interview, you cannot have anonymity. You have to, whoever's seeing them has to know. And so in this case, it would be identity is not disclosed. So they're going to know who they were, but they're not going to disclose it. Okay, so those are your 6 things. You just need to have a think about kind of which ones did they clearly tell you they did versus which ones can you basically suggest could also be done. So let's quickly do what I would do the 3 and 3 for here. And again, because this is so unlikely to be asked, I would just memorize these 3 and 3, and if it is asked, you can probably get your way through it that way. So rather than stressing a lot about it, I would just be like, if it's asked, this is what I would say. So if you were asked this, I would say 3 considerations in reporting the results. So this is in the actual documentation. So one thing I would say is kind of what we've already covered here, but you wouldn't be asked both, so that's fine, is that you need to maintain confidentiality of all identifying information. So anything that would be identifying needs to be not disclosed. So it needs to not just be their identifying, but also their identity, but anything that would help you guess who they were. Next thing is there needs to be objective presentation of all data or all findings. So we're really wanting to avoid situations where they're only saying things that are in support of the hypothesis or that are in support of what they wanted. So are all findings being presented? And third, we need to say that there needs to be the follow-up on not just the right to withdraw from the actual study, but the right to withdraw data. So ideally, the participants should actually be told what the conclusion is going to be and then be given. So these are the results. Do you still want it to go forward? That's going to be especially important if the findings are in any way socially sensitive. They may not want that to go through. Okay, in applying, and again, some of these are a bit of overlap for this ones, and that's fine because you'll be asked one or the other. Okay, so in applying, we're going to say, first of all, because this is now applying it, we should exercise caution with transferability. And again, this is one where we're going to be really specific. So what kind of situations could this be applied to or transferred to, and which ones could not? So be really clear on that and saying, here, are there any findings that were mentioned that you think might be relevant? Number two, when you are reporting, so this is kind of linked to reporting, but we're trying to do 3 and 3, is the report should be upfront about limitations. So we want to be upfront about any limitations, and also the report needs to be kind of be clear about what is the scope for application. In other words, like the researchers need to be clarifying how this could be useful. So they need to actually kind of here are my findings, and then clarify in what context might this be useful. And we want to here beware of any time it's being used for any sort of social control. So being really thoughtful about any instances where your results might be being misused. So really address it, what are the limitations, and then also be really clear about whether or not this should be applied in certain ways. And then there needs to be attempts at care for groups that would be impacted, including, but not only, the participants. So again, that probably links a bit here to the idea of offering some sort of support. So this could be counseling for the actual participants, things like that. Are there any potential for like prejudice to arise? Things like that. So in what way could the findings be negative for the participants? In what way could they be negative for larger populations? And if there are negative implications, what could be done to kind of offer support services, training, things like that? Okay, so I would memorize that just in case for the exam, but more likely you're going to be looking at that. The key to getting your 6 marks, like you memorize your 6, be careful. Some students memorize all 6 and they still don't get 6 marks because they're not being specific to the prompt. So just make sure every single thing that you say how it was done in the prompt or how it could be done in the prompt. So specific, specific, specific. Okay, since I started the video, I did get torrentially rained upon, so hair is now up and you can track my decline as the day has gone on. So we are now up to question 3. So looking specifically at essentially kind of applications is how I'm looking at it. So this is really how is the research being used? So issues related to that. So this is going to be bias, credibility, and generalizability. Reminder, you will only get asked one of the 3. So there are places where there's some overlap where like what you would say here, you could say here as well. That makes sense because you're not going to be asked both of them. So that is a logical thing. All right, so this is going to be, make sure my spacing is good, question 3, and I'm just calling it applications because we're really looking at essentially can we trust the research and therefore can we use it? So, which is good. I'm going to clarify in just a second. So remember, this is going to be important. This is the case for all of them, but this is worth 9 marks. You're not going to get all 9 marks if you're not being specific to the prompt. So make sure, we're going to make a reminder that you must be specific to the prompt. So I'm going to essentially give you an outline of how I would set up these responses. I'm going to kind of give you 3 paragraphs, and hopefully that's really helpful because that gives it some structure. But remember, within each paragraph, you can't just memorize what you're going to say because it has to constantly refer back. So this is giving you structure, not answers. Okay, so I said this in class, but I want to go through kind of the sequence that this should be. So it's not necessarily the sequence we did it in, but I want to kind of go through it conceptually, which is basically to say that when you're looking at this, the goal as you're looking and conducting research needs to be to reduce bias. If you effectively reduce bias, then you can ensure that the results that you publish are credible. So if we reduce bias, then that helps us to ensure credibility. And if our results are credible, that is one way that we can feel confident in generalizing or transferring them. So it depends on the type, but we're going to ensure credibility so that we can generalize or transfer. So I'm going to write generalize, but we will talk about kind of what that looks like in qualitative in a second. Okay, so that is going to be our little section here. So we're going to do it. I'll show you the little diagram. So this is the second part. So this is going to be one long chart, whereas this is going to be divided into 2. So the reason is that for reduced bias, it doesn't really matter whether you get quantitative or qualitative. You can basically structure it the same. It'll change which biases you include, but it doesn't change the structure. The other 2 are specific. So whether you get qualitative or quantitative, you kind of have to take a totally different look at it. So we'll go through that. In general, they ask about bias a lot for experimental work because the other 2 are a little bit, so they generally ask about generalizability or bias. Credibility tends to be asked more for qualitative, but we're going to cover all possibilities. So we don't want to take our guess, our luck, and then get a combination that we're not prepared for. So like I said, if you have bias, so we're going to kind of divide this into 3 sections now. So I'm going to make a little bit more room. That's not quite enough for bias. So we're going to do 1/3 of your remaining page for bias, 1/3 for credibility, and 1/3 for generalizability. And then, like I said, for the last 2, we'll divide it in 2, but we'll do bias first. So with bias, if I was writing on bias, I would divide it into 3 broad sections. So I would be looking at what are some sample biases, what are some participant biases, what are some research biases. So that just gives you, again, a little bit of a structure. So I'm going to go through them quickly because in class we did more detail. So I'm basically just going to list them, and with a little arrow, and say what would be a very short summary of what you could do. So that's, again, this is going to be pretty brief because you can go back to the chart we did in class for like the full information. So I'm deliberately being a little bit on the short side for this. So first thing I would be looking at is, are there biases in the sample? And I'm going to, again, list 4 biases and then essentially a 1-word prompt to remind you of how to go through that. So the biases could be gender bias. It could be a cultural bias. It could be an acquiescence bias. No, sorry, that's the wrong one. These 2 sound really similar. Ascertainment bias. You can just call it a selection bias. I'm just being more specific. Or it can be a self-selecting bias. So those are both forms of selection biases. So again, we're just going to go really quickly of what can you do about this. So if it was a gender bias, you should look at doing a stratified sampling and stratifying it by gender. If it's cultural, you should look at doing cross-cultural research. Not necessarily stratified because they may not have all the different cultural groups in your population to stratify with. And if it's either of these, you should look at instead doing random sampling. So those are nice and easy. It does depend on the prompt. So again, if the prompt doesn't have a gender bias, don't talk about gender bias. So the bias must be in the prompt. So you need to see, is there a cultural bias? And it needs to be relevant. So we talked about a bit about that in class. So don't talk about cultural bias if it's specifically for one culture. That's not a bias, that's intentional. So really make sure that you only mention biases that are relevant to the prompt here. Okay, participant bias. And for your participant bias, these are going to be method specific. So I am going to add, in addition to a very short solution, I am going to clarify what method it would go with. So this one might be a little bit longer. So you need to be specific. So if you are doing an experiment, the most common participant bias we see is demand characteristics. I don't know, I have so many markers in my hand. I don't even know I have a brown marker. All right, anyway, so demand characteristics. And the best way to avoid demand characteristics would be to use a deceptive aim. You can also use blinds, or you can use independent samples. So any of those would be tools that would eliminate that. Okay, if you were doing a survey, this is the one I got confused with, ascertainment, acquiescence bias. Just making up spellings now. It's something like that. So if you're doing an acquiescence bias, they're just saying yes, no matter what. So we should balance the questions and keep it short. Okay, if you are doing any sort of self-report, so that's going to include a survey or an interview, then we need to be looking out for social desirability bias. And we can avoid social desirability bias by making sure that we remove any judgment from our questions. So they should be neutral and not judgmental. So the questions shouldn't have a clear positive or negative answer. They should be as neutral as possible. If you are doing a focus group, then you could have conformity bias. And so the way around that, or dominant responder bias, so same idea, is you could either then kind of individually interview them afterwards, and also just making sure that you have a really skilled facilitator. So those are kind of obvious ones, but if that was a concern, then you should do some sort of individual follow-up. And also making sure you have skilled facilitators will also help with that. And then last, if you are doing an observation, then what we call it is kind of observation effects, but we call it Hawthorne effect, just after that study. So that's kind of the common term for it, where they're being observed. And the best solution for that would be to consider doing a covert observation instead. So make your observation covert instead. Okay, so those are your participant biases. Running out of room. So it's very sad. So then my last category, I'm going to have to erase the participant biases, but you have them written down, so it's all good. If not, rewind. So sample, participant, and then last we're going to have our researcher biases. Again, you need to think about in this context what is specific to the study, so what is relevant. So you need to look at any kind of things that are related to the design. So this is usually things like leading questions, like kind of any leading questions is probably the most obvious one. But there could be other ones in observations. It could be creating a checklist that's really clearly knows what it's looking for. So this one, again, you're just gonna have to kind of be specific. So have a look at kind of what they actually give you in the prompt and see if there's anything that stands out to you about the design. So don't just say design bias, only mention that if you have a specific design bias. But some examples, this is particularly for things like interviews and surveys, is to do a peer review. It could also be for things where there's really obvious demand characteristics. Run a pilot study. That's going to help with that. Do some method triangulation. So that is something else you can say is if there is a lot of inherent bias in the method, one option would be to include another method. That's great if the study's already told you it's done that. And then our favorite term, we can show our epistemological reflexivity, which just means we can at least consider whether or not the design chosen is going to be ideal for what we're trying to do. So reflecting on the choice of design. And then the other researcher bias would be essentially confirmation bias. So some sort of bias related to the actual results. So this is really in the designing of it, the researcher has to watch for bias. This is really in the actual interpretation of the data. So some things that we can do there. This is where blinds, again, can be really helpful. So it's possible, even if the participant knows which group it's been, that the researcher doesn't know. So that's really helpful for like an experiment. Anytime there's any subjectivity in the results, it could be that somebody else reads the actual observational notes and they make conclusions rather than the researcher. So that would fall under as well researcher triangulation. And then finally, personal reflexivity. And again, remember, we can use these terms again in credibility, so they're kind of appropriate in either case. They probably don't necessarily go with generalizability as well, but they're appropriate in either, which is just to say that the researcher should reflect on any potential biases that he has. Okay, so that's how you could go about the bias. For the next section, I'm going to divide it into qualitative and quantitative because you essentially need a different approach. So depending on what the prompt is. So we're going to spend a little bit more time in qualitative because of the fact that these are less familiar terms. If it's quantitative, it basically overlaps with kind of our price terms, the terms we've been using all of last year. So I think that should be a little bit more comfortable for you because it's not as new. So again, that's going to be qualitative. This is also going to be qualitative. And we kind of did this when we went through it in class. Oh no, too many quals. Quantitative. Okay, so quantitative and quantitative. So that's how we'll divide this up. But then I will look at it one area at a time. So credibility. So if we are looking at credibility, these are a little bit less neat, the categories, but I'm still going to give you kind of 3 things that I want you to think about and consider if you're assessing the credibility. So the first thing is kind of similar. Again, there's a little bit of overlap. So this is going to be related to the design or the method. So the first thing you need to think about if you're saying, is it credible? So again, when we say credibility, we're saying, is it an accurate representation? So remember, we're looking at basically, does it represent true experiences, feelings, etc.? So is it true to what is actually it says it's going to do? So we need to kind of look at how we go about that. So the first thing we should do is we should look at methodological concerns. And this is going to relate quite a bit to our actual bias kind of things. So we're going to basically go back to the biases. So refer to specific participant biases. So thinking about things, or some of these ones as well. So things like leading questions and so forth. So this is probably the biggest one that's going to link straight back, not the sample. Don't really look at sample biases, and the researcher is going to come on to the next one. So we're really looking at, is there anything that makes it prone to participant bias? And we're going to consider that here. And so some things that we want to do to kind of address that. Once we've looked at that, again, this is going to be somewhat similar. We are going to do method triangulation, and we're going to do epistemological reflexivity. So if we want our results to be credible, we need to consider whether there's any biases. We can also address the actual bias. So do whatever you said here to do to avoid the bias. But then on top of that, there are inherent problems with the methodology. So ideally, we should pair it with another methodology, and we should acknowledge and think about those inherent problems. Okay, next one, which kind of relates to researcher bias, but we just have a different term for it, is researcher credibility. So bias is part of this, but not all there is to it. So when we're looking at this, we want to think of three different things. So we want to consider the expertise of the researcher. So do we think the researcher is the right person for undertaking this job? So like I gave in class the example, if you're like, I'm going to go out and do some really in-depth, unstructured interviews on homelessness, I'd be like, I don't think you have the background to know that you can do that effectively, sensitively, and so forth, because you're a year 12 student. So it is, but if you were like, I want to do a study on serial position effect, I'd be like, go for it. So it really does depend on the method, what that is involved. Is there any reason why the bias should be there? So sometimes it might tell you the motive of the researcher, so bear that in mind. And then the other thing is there any clear preparation that the researcher has done? This is stuff that the prompt can be really helpful about. So have a look and see, does the prompt give you any information about either of those things? So then what are we going to do about that? So we are going to do essentially a repeat of here. Ideally, if there's any concerns about the researcher's credibility, researcher triangulation is a really effective tool to make it so that that researcher isn't the only one looking over it. And then the other thing, of course, is our personal reflexivity. Have a think about any of your biases that you might have as a researcher, and try to be as aware of those as possible so they're not in the back of your mind, but bringing them to the front of your mind would be helpful. And then our third thing, if we're doing credibility, is what we call our phenomenological approach. How do you spell phenomenon? I have it correctly here. Phenomenological approach. Basically, what we're saying here is that the participants need to agree that they think that your summary reflects their reality. So basically, the participants agree that findings equal reality. And so in order for that to be the case, the participants need to be given an opportunity to see the findings. And so that means that we need to do member checking. So again, a bit of overlap. If we know these terms, then we're using them kind of two different places, so that's helpful. And so that's how I would go about that, but again, making sure that we go through the prompt carefully, see if the prompt says it's already done any of these things. Otherwise, we can suggest them as well. So check what it refers to. So sometimes it will already tell you it's done triangulation, in which case you want to be like, good job with your triangulation. If it hasn't, then you want to be like, a suggestion would be to also do triangulation. Okay, if it is a quantitative study, so when we're talking quantitative studies, we're talking experiments or surveys. So if it is a quantitative study, we actually, credibility is essentially validity in this case. And when we're saying validity, we're saying, does it accurately address the aim? So when we're doing a quantitative, we usually have a more specific aim, and we're making a statistical conclusion. So now we're moving on a bit from trueness to accuracy. So here is my conclusion. I've stated it with a p-value. Is it true to the aim? Am I accurately addressing the aim that I say I am? So is my statistical conclusion accurate? Okay, so essentially, again, I'm going to tell you three things to look at, and these are terms you should be well familiar with. So first thing you want to consider is the internal validity. that's going to be higher for experiments, of course, than it's going to be for quasi-experiments or any sort of survey. So we would be looking at things like controls and IV manipulation. Surveys are a little bit weird. Surveys are really not going to be particularly high in internal validity because they're not really able to address cause and effect. So this is something that's going to be really good for experiments. So this is something to talk about. If you are talking about it for a survey, you would probably want to mention it more as a limitation. So because of the lack of the manipulation, they cannot really deduce cause and effect. Therefore, there is some question about the internal validity. Okay, but then our trade-off, of course, is ecological validity. So it is always a trade-off. We know this from ERQs. And now we are going to be looking at two things, which is we're going to be looking at the setting and also at the task. This is where doing a survey can be really positive. So surveys generally, instead of doing an artificial task, it's something that is self-report. So therefore they are not doing something out of the ordinary, they're just reflecting on real life experiences. So surveys are good for ecological validity. And then finally, and this is kind of something to consider for both, is construct validity. And so construct validity is basically how well have you operationalized your variables and how broad have you asked your questions. So if you're talking an experiment, you're probably talking more operationalizing. So how have you defined your IV and your DV? If you are talking broad, that's not very legible. So how broad are your questions? If you're doing a survey, of course we want to balance and not have surveys be super long, but is it fully unpacking the topic? So is your survey addressing all aspects or is it too narrow in kind of focus? So how broadly is it approaching the aim? Are the questions covering it well? Okay, so that is how you would go about a quantitative study for credibility, as you would really define credibility as being related to the validity. So it is credible if it is valid, and then you would go through those three types of validity. Again, I would say they're probably less likely to ask this, but it could happen, and it wouldn't be a bad thing because those are terms you're pretty familiar with. These I've seen asked both ways, so you can definitely see either here. So let's make sure we're really clear on both. So again, I'm going to basically just give you three things. This is probably the most straightforward, but also the most where you're going to have to actually just use your prompt a lot. So some of the mark schemes I've seen have lots of kind of prompt specific. So these are where I really think you have to look at your prompt, because it really depends so much on the sample. So that's really like, you just have to read it really carefully. So I'll give you three things to consider, but really you're just maybe going through your prompt and making sure you're happy with that. So the first thing, if we are doing qualitative, is we could ask, is there any representational generalizability? And so what we're saying there is, do these results stretch out to any sort of broader population? So is there any sort of spreading out? So this would be something like to a larger population. It's usually not the goal, but it does depend on the size and representation. So representational representatives of the sample. It is sometimes appropriate. So some qualitative like interviews are really not a specific group. It's more just they're interviewing a cross-section of the population. So in that case, you could say, oh, in this case, I actually think there is a grounds for representational generalizability. So they've done a large sample across a lot of different things. Even though they did interviews, I think it sustains that. Okay, the next thing is if it's not representational of a larger group, but is quite specific, then you would be looking at inferential generalizability. Or, because one time they just straight up said transferability in the question, so it's really important to recognize that this is essentially the one that relates to transferability. If they asked you about transferability, you certainly could say you know, not able to be generalized, but can be transferred, so you can really focus on that. So this is all about transferring it not out, but across. So a representational is, this is boom, boom. So we're actually transferring it only to a similar context. And it's really about the context, even more than the group, but a group of people in the similar context. So that's really the key, and this is where you have to really use the prompt. So you need to really think through what is the context. So what kind of context is this study? And then what appropriate other context might it be appropriate for? So you need to look at the study's context and consider whether or not there are other contexts that might be similar or not. So this is all about if it's true of abuse victims here, it could be true of abuse victims in a different kind of setting, but you need to spell that out. So when could you do it? And then the third one is theoretical. And that basically says it's not really about the people or the context, it's about the understanding. So in this case, you're applying them not to other people, but to an understanding. So this time you're going to use it to develop or refine theory. So the best example of that would be like Festinger's doomsday cult study that we did last year in transition, 2 years ago. So he wasn't trying to say all people would act this way in a doomsday cult. You could argue he could transfer it to other doomsday cults, but that would be a very specific transferability. But you could say, but he used it, even though it's a very specific context, it still helped him understand people. Therefore, it was used to develop cognitive dissonance as a theory. So it was used to develop theory, not necessarily to explain cult members. That wasn't really the goal. Okay, so that's how you would go about that one. That's probably my least favorite possible prompt because it's a bit fiddly, involves a lot of trying to unpack what the question says, but they have asked it before, so it could happen, and I think that at least gives you somewhere to kind of go in terms of structure. Don't super love this one either. I don't think I like generalizability. So quantitative, so in this case, we're gonna use a very specific term. So we're gonna refer to it as statistical generalizability. It is very similar to representational. So it is essentially the same idea, but it is basically saying it with the backing of a statistical test. So with the backing of a affirmative p-value, then you can do it. So it is also going sample to population. And it is based on a significant p-value. So if you don't have a significant p-value, we accept the null hypothesis and we do not generalize those results because the results were not significant. All right, so when we talk about this, this is possible if you sustain external validity. So when we talk external validity, we're not so much worried. These are actually, ecological validity kind of fits into both, but these are all related to basically the nature of the task. This is more saying, are those conclusions valid outside the study? So this is all looking at outside the study. So is it still true outside of the study? So that's a good way of thinking of this. So still true outside the study. And I'm just going to list the three types because I think these are familiar enough to you guys that you should be able to essentially go through this with your understanding. So you would have to look at the population validity. We do this quite a lot in our studies, so I think we're good on this. So we're looking at does the sample represent the population? So that's a big one, but it's not the only thing in terms of generalizability. We often use them interchangeably in ERQs. So if the population validity is high, we're happy to generalize. But we should look at these other two things as well. So then ecological validities, like I said, that one kind of goes both places. Because if the study was really artificial, then we would need to be careful in generalizing it to any kind of context outside the study. So if it's a really specific kind of artificial task, we would need to be really careful when generalizing to the population because they haven't done that task, and we need to be careful with assuming that says anything about their day-to-day life. And then lastly, temporal validity, when that's important. So temporal validity is not a huge issue all the time. So like if I was writing about Dragansky and the juggling study, I wouldn't really bring up temporal validity because there's no reason to think juggling nor neuroplasticity is changing with time. But if I was talking about prejudice, stereotypes, if I was doing Steele and Aronson stereotype threat, I definitely would mention that because I would say that there's a lot of change in kind of attitudes and all of that over time. So it really does depend on whether it's relevant. So again, you're going to have to use the prompt here. So you really need to really question all of these in the prompt. So not just defining them, but actually doing that. And again, that's what you're kind of used to doing with our studies in general. So that should be somewhat familiar territory. All right, that's everything.